I never thought my own sons would treat me like a burden after I gave them everything. I never imagined they would take my retirement savings, telling me it was for the family, only to spend it on themselves. But what they didn't know was that I had planted a seed years ago, one they would one day have to bow before. Get ready, because this isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. Comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. My name is Dolores Vega, but everyone on my block calls me Lola. I'm 71 years old, born and raised in San Antonio, Texas. If you've ever walked the west side at sunrise, you know the way the air smells like warm dust and fresh tortillas, and how the first buses sigh at the corner before the city really wakes. That's my world. I've lived long enough to know who I am, what I can stand and what I won't. Thought I knew my family too. That part I was wrong about. I had 2 babies with my late husband Arturo, Marco and Julian. I carried them, fed them, and watched them grow into men with big plans. I carried those plans too on my back and in my wallet, even after Arturo passed. I was the one who kept the lights on, who said yes to field trip fees when there wasn't much left in the pantry, who learned how to stretch chicken into 3 dinners without anyone going hungry. I wanted my boys to feel safe, to feel backed, to believe that when they put their foot down, the ground would hold steady under them. I thought the ground would hold steady under me as well. When you get to my age, you understand that pain doesn't always come with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes it arrives at your own kitchen table in friendly voices, with hands you once held while they took their first steps. You can be looking at the faces you love most and not realize that they are here to take something you cannot easily replace. People call that betrayal. I call it the night I stopped sleeping through till morning. I'm telling you this in my own voice because for a long time I didn't have one. I had duties. I had a time card. I had a mortgage. I had 2 boys who needed new shoes every school year and band fees and gas money. For 30 years I worked in a school cafeteria, the kind with long metal tables that echo when the kids laugh, the kind where the smell of pizza day clings to your clothes even after you wash them. I was proud of that job. The work was honest and it kept my boys fed. Back then, pride tasted like black coffee in a styrofoam cup and felt like the ache in my knees at the end of a double shift. San Antonio held me up while I did all that. The bus drivers who waited an extra beat when they saw me hurry across Guadalupe Street. The cashier at the corner store, Mr. Ramirez, who would set aside the paper for me because he knew I liked to do the crossword after dinner. The church ladies who didn't ask questions when a casserole pan came back late. They knew timing is a luxury when you're juggling everything. My life was steady. It was small maybe, but it was mine. I owned my little brick house fair and square by the time I turned 68. The paint on the porch rail needed touching up, and the bougainvillea by the back fence refused to listen to me. But that house had my name on it and a heartbeat I could hear when I stood still. Marco and Julian were proud of me, or that's what they said on birthdays and holidays. Marco, the oldest, stood like he was always staging a photo. Chin up, chest wide, voice louder than necessary. He worked construction and talked about flipping houses, about catching the wave. Julian was the smoother talker, always quick with a compliment, a joke, a plan. He bounced from one sales job to another, calling each change a step up. They were different in style, but alike in one way. They believed the future would bend for them if they asked with enough confidence. I wanted to believe that too. I wanted to believe it so much that I ignored the early signs that something had shifted. A joke here about my old-fashioned ways, a comment there about me sitting on equity, as if a home was just a number on paper and not the place where their father's picture hung. One evening Marco stood in my kitchen, leaned against the counter and said, "Ma, you don't need all this space. We could make this place work for us." He tapped the formica like it was an ATM machine. I laughed it off. I told him this house had already worked for us. It gave him somewhere safe to come home to when jobs went quiet and plans went loud. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes that made my shoulders tense. Julian wasn't any better. He'd scroll his phone at my table telling me about new apps that made money move faster, like money was a bird he could whistle for. He teased me for keeping cash in envelopes, for writing down bill due dates in a spiral notebook with a blue pen. "Mom, you gotta stop thinking like a cafeteria worker," he said once, smiling like it was a kindness. "Think like a boss." I looked at the list of groceries on my counter and thought, I do think like a boss, just not the kind you understand. The thing about getting older is that people start talking around you, as if your years have turned you into furniture. But age is not a fog. Age is bright. I hear more than people think. I saw the way my boys looked at each other when I mentioned the house being paid off. The way they traded glances when I said I was thinking about fixing the fence in the spring. I felt the chill under the warmth, the way a tile on the kitchen floor can look fine but wobble under your weight the moment you step on it. That's one. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself sons are sons and men like to talk big. I told myself that respect doesn't always sound like yes, ma'am. But I heard another sound too. It was quiet at first. It was the sound of being necessary to people who had stopped seeing you. It's hard to explain that sound. It's the pause before a request, the quick change of subject when you ask a real question, the way love starts to feel like a negotiation. It made me tired in a way the cafeteria never did. If you had walked past my house on a Sunday afternoon last spring, you would have thought everything was fine. You would have seen me on the porch with my coffee, sleeves rolled up, sunlight on the peeling paint. You would have heard Tejano music from someone's garage and smelled grilled onions from a few doors down. I waved to the neighbors, asked after their kids, nodded along to their stories. That's what we do here. We hold each other up with small kindnesses. But when I closed my door and the house settled around me, when the air conditioner kicked on and the hum filled the rooms, my chest felt tight. I pressed my hand to the table the way I used to press it to a child's forehead to check for fever, as if the wood itself could tell me if something was wrong. I keep Arturo's photo on the hallway shelf. He's wearing the shirt he loved, the one with the tiny checks, and he looks like he's about to laugh. Sometimes I talk to that photo when the house is quiet and the clock over the stove ticks loud. I did my best, I tell him. I did what we said we would do. He doesn't answer, of course. But the talking helps. It reminds me that I come from a promise kept, not a promise broken. This is the part where I should say I saw it coming, that I braced for it, that I had a plan. I didn't. I had trust. I had history. I had sons whose first words I can still hear if I close my eyes. I had a set of keys that felt heavy in my hand because they opened the front door to a life I built one paycheck at a time. I believed those keys meant safety. I believed my boys understood that some lines are not crossed. I believed love was thicker than paperwork, thin as onion skin, it turns out. That's two. People will tell you that mothers forgive anything. Maybe that's true. Maybe forgiveness is what keeps a mother's heart beating when everything else tries to stop it. But forgiveness is not the same as permission. And that night, the night they sat across from me with big words and bigger smiles, taught me the difference. I'm going to tell you what happened. I'm going to tell you exactly how the words sounded in my kitchen, how the pen felt in my hand, how the air changed when I realized what I'd done. I will tell you what they took, and I will tell you what I found when I had nothing left to lean on. Before I do, I want you to know this. I am not ashamed. Hurt, yes. Tired, yes. But not ashamed. Shame belongs to the ones who knew better and did it anyway. My name is Lola. I am 71. I live in San Antonio, Texas. My sons are Marco and Julian. They are the reason I learned how to stand up at this age without raising my voice. They are the reason I discovered a door I didn't know I'd been holding the key to. And this is how it all began. Before the storm there was rhythm. My days followed a pattern so steady that sometimes I thought of it as a song only I could hear. Mornings began with coffee strong enough to wake the bones, sipped slowly on the porch as the sky over San Antonio turned from gray to gold. The hum of traffic along the main road carried the day forward, and I carried myself through it with purpose. Retirement wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and after decades of double shifts, aching knees, and cold suppers, having a little peace felt like a gift. The house was my jewel. A modest brick home on the west side, nothing flashy, but it stood proud. Arturo and I bought it together when Marco was 3 and Julian still wore diapers. I remember him hammering shelves into the garage, promising he'd turn it into a workshop one day. Life didn't let him see that through, but after he passed, the house became my monument to him. Every creak in the floorboard, every mark on the doorframe where the boys' heights were measured, every squeaky hinge whispered the story of us. Paying it off was no small feat, but the day I held the deed with my name alone printed on it, I cried until my hands trembled. That house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was proof I had endured. I lived carefully. Bills first, groceries second, a little tucked away in envelopes for emergencies. Some might call it old-fashioned, but it kept me safe. I never liked the idea of fancy accounts or apps that moved money faster than thought. My way was slower, but it was solid, like bricks stacked one by one. And then there were my boys. Marco, the oldest, carried himself like a man destined for bigger things. Broad-shouldered, loud-voiced, always with an opinion on how money should move. He worked in construction, but his eyes were always on the next project, the next flip, the next big win. He'd talk about leveraging assets, like he'd just come back from a seminar. Sometimes I wondered if he even believed the words he said or if he just liked the way they made him sound. Julian, my youngest, was different. Slick, charming, with a smile that could smooth over the roughest conversation. He never stayed in one job long enough to plant roots. One month he was selling insurance, the next it was cars, then tech gadgets. He'd brag about commissions that barely lasted the weekend, always certain the next deal would be the one. People liked him. I'll admit I liked him too, even when I didn't trust half of what came out of his mouth. Together they were oil and water, but when it came to me they shared one thing: impatience. They didn't understand why I clung to that little house or why I saved the way I did. Marco teased me about being asset-rich, cash-poor, as if those words could shame me. Julian laughed at my envelopes, saying, "Mom, you act like we're living in the 1950s. They meant it as jokes, but each time they said it, a sliver of doubt pressed deeper into me. I ignored the doubt. That's what mothers do. We tell ourselves our children don't mean the sharpness in their voices, that their eyes don't wander to what we have but to what we represent. I wanted to believe they loved me for being me, not for the ground I stood on. So I noticed. The way Marco's gaze lingered on the house, as if he could already see the dollar signs painted across the bricks. I noticed Julian scrolling his phone at my table, talking about real estate apps, about how property is power. Their words hung in the air like humidity on a Texas afternoon, thick, heavy, unavoidable. But life before betrayal was not without joy. Sundays were my favorite. Sometimes the boys would come over, bringing noise and mess into the quiet halls. Marco would brag about his latest construction job. Julian would charm me with stories that made him the hero. I'd cook too much food, and for a little while, the house felt alive the way it did when Arturo was still here. It was during those Sundays that I told myself everything was fine. The laughter, the clutter of shoes at the door, the smell of tortillas warming on the stove. Those moments let me believe the cracks in our family were just shadows, not fractures. I held on to them like a rosary bead, small comforts I could rub between my fingers when the silence returned. What I didn't know was that beneath the laughter, beneath the visits and the hugs, something else was growing. Something sharper. They weren't just joking about my house. They weren't just teasing about my savings. They were circling like buzzards waiting for the air to still. I wish I could say I saw it clearly back then, that I knew what was coming. But when love covers your eyes, it's hard to see the storm building on the horizon. And in San Antonio, storms can roll in fast, turning sunlight into darkness in the span of a heartbeat. That storm came to me not with thunder or lightning, but with paperwork. And it began on an evening when both my sons sat across from me at my own kitchen table. Smiles too wide, voices too smooth, asking me to trust them one more time. It was a Thursday evening when it happened. I remember because the air was heavy, sticky in that way San Antonio gets when the day refuses to cool down even after the sun drops. I had just finished washing the dinner dishes, the scent of garlic still clinging to my hands. Marco called earlier, his voice too cheerful, asking if he and Julian could come by. I thought it was unusual. My boys rarely came together unless it was a holiday or someone's birthday. But I didn't question it. A mother doesn't turn away her children. They arrived just as the cicadas began their song outside. Marco came in first, his boots clapping against the kitchen tile, his voice filling the house like it always did. Julian followed, flashing his smile, carrying a six-pack of soda as if that alone proved this was just a casual visit. We sat around the kitchen table, the one Arturo and I bought secondhand decades ago. Its edges are worn, the varnish rubbed thin where countless elbows rested during homework, arguments and prayers. Ez heard everything. That night it heard betrayal. Marco leaned forward, clasping his big hands together. "Mom," he said with the seriousness of a man about to deliver news that could change everything, "we've got an opportunity." I looked at him, then at Julian, who was nodding along as if rehearsed. My stomach tightened. Opportunities in my son's mouths always meant risk in mine. Julian slid a folder across the table. His cologne lingered as he did, sharp and artificial. "It's a real estate project," he said smoothly. "Condo development on the east side. The city's putting money into revitalizing the area. It's a sure thing." Marco jumped in before I could respond. "We've already got a foot in the door. Contractors ready, permits lined up. We just need the capital to close the deal. This is it, Mom. This is how we finally set the family up. No more scraping by. No more small dreams." I didn't open the folder. I just kept my hands flat on the table, staring at the pages inside as if they might bite. "And what does this have to do with me?" I asked, though a part of me already knew. Julian's smile softened, practiced. "We want you to be part of it. You've worked hard your whole life, saved everything. Instead of letting it sit there collecting dust, you can invest. With us. With your sons." Marco leaned closer, lowering his voice like a conspirator. "It's not just an investment, Mom. It's security. You'll never have to worry about money again. We'll take care of you. You'll be part of something big." The words tangled in my chest. Take care of me. Hadn't I taken care of them for decades? Hadn't I sacrificed until my bones ached so they could stand taller? Now they sat across from me, selling me a dream as if I were a stranger at one of Julian's pitches. I wanted to say no. I wanted to push the folder back across the table and tell them my retirement was not for sale. But when Marco looked at me with those wide eyes, so much like his father's when he wanted to convince me of something, and when Julian squeezed my hand with that boyish charm, I faltered. "Mom," Julian whispered, "this is for the family. Don't you trust us?" The question was a knife. Trust. The very thing I had given them since the day they were born. Trust when I left them with neighbors while I worked doubles. Trust when they stumbled through their 20s. Burning through jobs and girlfriends. Trust when Marco borrowed small amounts, promising to pay me back and never did. Trust when Julian swore he'd turned a corner, only to show up a month later with another excuse. I trusted them because they were mine. Because they were all I had left of Arturo. So with my throat tight and my pulse pounding in my ears, I nodded. "I trust you." Marco smiled wide, relief flooding his face. Julian exhaled as though the hardest part of the evening had passed. They pulled out more papers, slid a pen toward me. "Just sign here, Mom. It's all standard. We'll handle the rest." I held the pen heavy as iron. My hands trembled slightly, but neither of them noticed. They were too busy talking about timelines, returns, profits. Their voices blurred together, a chorus of promises. I glanced at the fine print, but my eyes swam. At 71, those contracts looked like foreign language. I caught glimpses, words like transfer, liability, full amount. I opened my mouth to ask questions, but Julian squeezed my shoulder and said, "Don't worry. We've got you." I signed. The pen scratched across the paper, and with every stroke, a piece of me splintered. My house, my savings, my safety. All tied to their promise. When I set the pen down, Marco clapped his hands together, triumphant. Julian kissed my cheek, smelling of cologne and triumph. They left that night full of plans, full of energy, leaving me alone in the quiet house. I stared at the folder on the table, the ink still wet, the papers now heavy with the weight of my trust. Outside, the cicadas droned on. Inside, my heart whispered a warning I didn't want to hear. I had just handed over everything. The months that followed bled together like ink in rain. At first, I told myself everything would be fine. Marco called twice after I signed, his voice brisk, filled with updates I didn't quite understand. Permits cleared, contractors lined up, returns expected by fall. Julian texted me once, a simple "trust the process, Mom." I clung to those words like a lifeline, repeating them in the quiet of my kitchen when doubt pressed against me. But then the calls stopped, and the letters started. At first they were polite notices, envelopes stamped in bold red, asking for payments I didn't recognize. I called Marco. He said not to worry, that it was just paperwork. But the envelopes kept coming, each one colder than the last. Words like default and foreclosure crept into my world. One morning, a man in a pressed shirt knocked on my door. His smile was tight, his clipboard tighter. He asked if I understood that my house had been put up as collateral. I remember blinking at him, the word collateral bouncing around my head like a marble in an empty jar. My house. The one I had scrubbed, patched, painted, and prayed over. My house was no longer mine. I called my boys over and over. Marco finally answered, his voice sharp with irritation. "It's complicated, Mom. The market shifted. We'll fix it." Julian didn't answer at all. Weeks later, the knock on the door was not polite. A notice was taped to the frame, bright as blood. I had 60 days to vacate. I can't tell you the shame of packing your life into boxes when you thought those days were long behind you. I wrapped dishes in old towels, stacked Arturo's books into crates, and wept as I folded clothes that smelled of cedar and thyme. Every object carried weight, the weight of years, of memories, of promises broken. Neighbors watched. Some offered help, their eyes soft with pity. Others whispered. I felt their stares on my back as I carried box after box to my car. I, who had been so proud, so careful, was now the subject of their hushed conversations. The old woman who lost her home. For a time I lived in the spare room of a friend from church. A small space, barely big enough for a bed and a dresser, but at least it was a roof. Nights were the hardest. Lying awake, I'd stare at the ceiling and replay every detail of that night at the kitchen table. The folder, the pen, the way Julian had said, "Don't worry, Mom." My trust had become my undoing. I was at my lowest. No house. No savings. No security. My body ached, my heart heavier than ever. And yet, life has a way of placing clues in our path when we least expect it. One afternoon, I drove to a storage unit where I had tucked away Arturo's things years earlier. It was a gray building with rows of metal doors, each one a vault of forgotten lives. I opened mine, and the smell of dust and old cardboard rushed out. I sat on the concrete floor and began sorting through boxes. Photos yellowed at the edges, Arturo's tools, Marco's old football trophies, Julian's band posters. Each object tugged at me, a reminder of a life built and lived. Then, near the bottom of a crate marked "Papers," I found it. A battered accordion folder, edges frayed, elastic bands stretched thin. My brother Manuel's handwriting scrawled across the front. Business documents, Vega and Company. Manuel had been gone for nearly 20 years. He was always the dreamer, starting little ventures, trying his hand at enterprises that never quite took off. I almost set the folder aside, assuming it was another half-forgotten idea. But something in me said, "Look closer." Inside, I found more than I expected. Neatly folded certificates, contracts, and, tucked between them, a letter from a lawyer I vaguely remembered meeting at Manuel's funeral. My heart stuttered as I read. The documents showed that years ago, before his health declined, Manuel had registered a small janitorial business and listed me as a silent partner, giving me shares in the company. At the time, I thought it was symbolic, his way of including me, and I never gave it much attention. But according to the lawyer's letter, Those shares were protected and tied to certain rights if the business ever expanded. My hands trembled as I flipped to the back of the folder. There, in faded ink, was a clause about transfer of ownership and voting rights, should the company be acquired or merged. I sat in that cold storage unit, papers spread around me like puzzle pieces, my heart pounding. Could it be possible? After losing everything, after being cast aside by my own flesh and blood, could I still hold something of value? I pressed my hand over my mouth, whispering Arturo's name as tears filled my eyes. For the first time in months, I didn't feel only broken. I felt a spark, faint, fragile but real. I had stumbled upon a door I never knew existed, and in my hand I held the key. For days I carried that folder around like a secret flame, hiding it under my pillow at night, slipping it into my tote when I left the house. I was terrified someone would take it from me before I could understand what it meant. At 71, my eyes don't dance across fine print the way they used to, but I read and reread every page until the words blurred. The more I pieced together, the more I realized Manuel's little janitorial venture hadn't stayed little. The letter mentioned a company name, Silverpath Services. At first it meant nothing to me. But when I typed it into the old laptop my grandson had fixed for me years ago, I almost dropped my glasses. Silverpath wasn't just a janitorial outfit anymore. It had grown into one of the largest facility management corporations in Texas, contracting with hospitals, universities, and even city buildings. What began as my brother pushing a mop in a borrowed van had become an empire. And tucked in that folder were documents tying me to it. Shares, voting rights, dividends. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, and for a long time I sat there staring at the screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Could it be real? Had I, after losing everything, been holding on to something all along? The next morning, I gathered my courage and called the number on the lawyer's letter, half expecting a deadline. To my surprise, a young woman answered. I explained who I was, fumbling, my voice shaking. She put me on hold, then transferred me to a man who introduced himself as David Morales, a partner at the firm. Mrs. Vega, he said after listening to my story, I've been waiting years for someone to call about those papers. Most families never follow up. But you, ma'am, you still have rights. He explained that when Silverpath had absorbed my brother's company, the silent partners had been carried forward. Most had sold their stakes years ago. But me, I still held mine. A tiny share, yes, but because of a protective clause Manuel had insisted on, my portion couldn't be diluted without my consent. And with Silverpath now expanding aggressively, that tiny share had grown into something significant. Significant? I asked, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles went white. Enough that you'd want to exercise your rights, he said gently. You're entitled to dividends. More than that, if you wish, you could increase your position. Quietly. Quietly. That word echoed. I met David in his office downtown a week later. The building was tall, glass gleaming against the Texas sun. I walked into that lobby with second-hand shoes and a heart pounding like a drum. He greeted me warmly, offering coffee in a porcelain cup, not the styrofoam I was used to. We sat across from each other at a polished table while he laid everything out. Silverpath is strong, he said, but they're seeking additional capital for an acquisition. If you want, you could form a holding company, take part in the round, and secure yourself a voice at the table. The words washed over me. I was a cafeteria worker, a widow, a mother who had just been tossed aside by her sons. What business did I have playing in this world of shares and holdings? But then I thought of Arturo. I thought of the nights I sat with envelopes spread out across the kitchen table, calculating how to stretch $30 into meals for a week. I thought of the hours on my feet, hands cracked from dish soap, back screaming, yet never giving up. I thought of the house I had earned, the house I had lost. I had been managing resources my whole life. Just not the kind they put in portfolios. So, with David's guidance, I did something I never imagined. I formed Magnolia Rice Holdings LLC. I took what little I had left, savings tucked in a coffee tin, a condolence gift Arturo's cousin had pressed into my palm after the funeral, and I invested. It wasn't much compared to the giants at the table, but paired with my protected shares, it was enough. Enough to give me standing. Enough to give me a foothold in a company that was quietly becoming one of the most influential in the state. I didn't tell Marco. I didn't tell Julian. Let them believe I was broken, helpless, dependent. Let them think their betrayal had left me with nothing but memories. Every time I looked at that folder, every time I signed another document with Magnolia Rise's name, I felt something rise in me too. Not revenge. Not yet. Just strength. A calm, steady strength like water gathering behind a dam. I whispered to Arturo's photo one night, the papers spread out on the bed beside me. They think I'm finished. But I'm not. Not yet. The city lights outside blinked like quiet applause. Life has a way of correcting itself even when you try to bend it to your will. I didn't lift a finger against my sons, but I didn't need to. Their choices carried weight, and that weight began to crush them on its own. Marco was the first to feel it. His construction work dried up almost overnight. Jobs he bragged about never materialized. Contractors he had promised quick payments to started calling him names I won't repeat. One morning, I overheard his voice through the thin walls of the guest room I was renting at my church friend's house. He was outside, shouting on the phone, begging a supplier for one more chance. When he hung up, I heard him slam his truck door so hard the sound rang out like thunder. Julian wasn't faring much better. He'd taken a flashy office job with a marketing startup, telling anyone who would listen that he was finally breaking six figures. Within 6 months, the company folded. I heard about it not from him, but from one of the church ladies whose nephew had worked there. She leaned across the potluck table and whispered, "Did you know Julian's out of work again?" I smiled politely, pretending I did. Pretending I wasn't learning about my son's struggles the same way neighbors gossip about weather. The irony? Both of them eventually landed work under the umbrella of Silverpath Services, the very company I now held influence in. Marco, desperate for steady pay, signed on as a site supervisor for a hospital expansion. Julian, slick as ever, snagged a mid-level sales role at one of the facility branches Silverpath had acquired. Neither of them knew that their new employer carried my fingerprints in its foundations. And I didn't tell them. I kept my silence, watching from the shadows. Each paycheck they collected, each meeting they sat through, was tethered to the quiet shares in my folder. The company was expanding rapidly, taking over contracts across Texas. Magnolia Rise Holdings, my holding company, was on every document. I may have lived in a borrowed room with a second-hand dresser, but behind the curtain, my name carried weight in boardrooms my sons couldn't even imagine. I wish I could say I felt satisfaction, but what I felt was quieter, heavier. It wasn't glee. It was inevitability, the way rain falls on a roof already leaking. Meanwhile, my boys came around less and less. When they did, it was only to vent. Marco complained about impossible deadlines and crews that didn't respect him. Julian groaned about quotas and managers who didn't understand his potential. They spoke to me as if I were a sounding board, not the mother they had nearly ruined. Not once did they ask if I was comfortable in that tiny guest room. Not once did they apologize for the house they had taken from me. At night, I lay awake listening to the hum of the old air conditioner in that borrowed room, my heart steady but tired. They thought I was powerless, a relic of the past. They didn't know I sat in meetings downtown, quiet but present, nodding as executives discussed expansions. They didn't know the dividends being deposited into Magnolia Rise's account were slowly building into something that could buy me not just a home, but security beyond what they had stolen. The pressure wasn't only on them, it pressed against me too. Every time I looked at their faces, I wanted to scream, to demand, "Why wasn't I enough? Why did you take what I built with my bare hands and gamble it away?" But I bit my tongue. I let silence do the work. Silence has a way of being louder than words when the walls begin to crack. And those cracks widened. Marco's marriage faltered. His wife grew tired of the missed paychecks, the empty promises, the late nights spent at bars instead of at home. Julian bounced checks he couldn't cover, his smooth smile no longer enough to charm the bank. Their voices, once so full of confidence, began to sound strained, like violins pulled too tight. They had treated me like a burden, an old woman who should just hand over her safety net and sit quietly in the corner. But fate had placed them right under the roof of the company I now had a stake in. Every time they clocked in, they worked for me. They didn't know it yet, but they would, sooner than they imagined. The day of the reveal began like any other in San Antonio. Hot, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the asphalt. I woke early, dressed carefully. Not fancy, but deliberate. A navy dress, pearl earrings Arturo gave me on our 20th anniversary, and shoes that pinched a little but made me feel steady. In the mirror I studied my reflection. 71 years stared back at me, lined and softened by time, but behind my eyes was a sharpness my sons had forgotten I carried. Silver Path Services was holding a town hall meeting downtown. They had just finalized the acquisition of a regional administrative company that oversaw contracts for clinics, schools, and offices across Texas. Employees were invited. Partners were invited. The media had been tipped off. The event was meant to signal growth, strength, a new chapter. I arrived early, escorted by David Morales, the lawyer who had helped me navigate the shares. We walked through glass doors into a lobby that gleamed like polished stone, the kind of place that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and ambition. Employees streamed in, their badges swinging on lanyards. I recognized faces in the crowd, Marco's broad shoulders, Julian's slicked back hair. My heart rattled, but my steps stayed steady. We filed into the auditorium, rows of chairs facing a stage draped with banners bearing Silverpath's logo. The CEO took the podium, his voice booming through the microphone. He spoke of growth, of new contracts, of a future brighter than ever. Applause echoed. Then his tone shifted, warmer, proud. Today, he said, we also welcome a long-standing partner who has chosen this moment to step out from behind the curtain. Someone whose faith and patience have been part of our foundation from the very beginning. My breath caught. The room rustled, people shifting in their seats. I could feel Marco and Julian's eyes flicking toward the stage, curious. The CEO extended a hand. Please join me in welcoming the principal of Magnolia Rise Holdings LC, Mrs. Dolores Vega. My name rang out like a bell. Heads turned. Whispers swept the room like a gust of wind. Slowly I rose from my seat. My knees ached, but I walked steady, every step measured. My sons' faces. Oh, I will never forget them. Marco's jaw dropped, his mouth open in shock. Julian blinked rapidly, as if trying to convince himself he was seeing wrong. I mounted the stage, took the CEO's hand, and turned to face the audience. A sea of eyes stared back at me. Employees, partners, my own flesh and blood. I want to thank you, I began, my voice steady, for welcoming me today. I never thought life would lead me here. But it seems life has a way of circling back, doesn't it? Laughter rippled politely, though in the corner of my vision I saw my sons frozen pale. For many years I worked quietly, raised my boys, served food in a school cafeteria, paid off a house dollar by dollar. And along the way, I was blessed to hold a small piece of something my late brother began. I never imagined it would grow into this. I gestured at the banners, the lights, the gathered crowd. But here we are. The room clapped, warm and respectful. I let it wash over me, though my eyes never strayed far from Marco and Julian. Their expressions were a study in panic and disbelief. The CEO leaned in, murmuring, "Would you like to say anything else?" "Yes," I said softly, then louder, "Yes, I would." I stepped forward, the microphone close. "Some of you may know my sons, Marco and Julian Vega. They work among you. They are talented men, ambitious men. But ambition without gratitude is a dangerous thing. Years ago they convinced me to sign away the safety I had worked for all my life. They left me with nothing. Nothing but faith." The room went utterly still. I could feel the tension stretch, tight as wire. Marco shifted in his seat, eyes darting, while Julian's face flushed red. But faith, I continued, has a way of returning what was taken. I stand here today not as a victim but as an owner. Magnolia Rise Holdings is my company, my shield, my answer to those who thought they could bury me. Applause thundered. Some rose to their feet. Cameras flashed. I held steady, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the two faces that once smiled across my kitchen table as they asked me to trust them. The reveal was complete. The power they thought belonged only to them now stood in my hands, plain for the world to see. And they couldn't look away. When the applause faded and people rose from their chairs, the room shifted into chatter, laughter, handshakes, and congratulations. But my sons didn't move. Marco sat stiff in his seat, his jaw locked tight, his eyes fixed on the stage as if he could will me to disappear. Julian fidgeted, smoothing his tie again and again, blinking fast like a man caught in a lie he hadn't prepared for. I stepped down from the stage, each heel tapping against the polished floor. Executives came forward to shake my hand, staff nodded politely, and a few even thanked me for believing in the company. But I was watching only two faces in the crowd. When I finally reached them, Julian was the first to speak. "Mom," he stammered, voice cracking, why didn't you tell us?" I looked at him, at the boy who once used to sit at the kitchen counter and charm me into giving him an extra $1 for lunch. His eyes now darted like a cornered animal. "Because you didn't ask," I said, my tone calm but sharp enough to cut. Marco stood then, his size still imposing but the bravado gone. His voice came out low, almost pleading. "You made us look like fools." I held his gaze. "No, Marco. You did that yourselves the night you put papers in front of me and told me to trust you. You didn't just take my savings. You took my dignity. And now you sit here working for the company I quietly own. That's not me making you look like a fool. That's the truth doing what it always does, coming to light." He swallowed hard, fists clenching at his sides. Julian reached for my hand, but I pulled it back. "Mom, we were trying to help everyone. We thought the condo deal would." I cut him off. "Don't." My voice was firm, steady. "Don't dress it up now. You wanted quick money. You saw me not as your mother but as your wallet. And when it all fell apart, you left me with nothing." They both went silent, eyes down. Around us, the crowd had thinned, employees heading back to their offices, the CEO and lawyers busy in side conversations. But a few lingered, their ears tilted in our direction, pretending not to listen. Let them hear. Let the truth echo wider than just these walls. "You know what polite cruelty looks like?" I asked softly, leaning closer so only they could hear. "It looks like paperwork slid across a table. It looks like sons smiling while they strip their mother of her safety. You didn't shout. You didn't strike. You just signed me away." Marco's lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Julian wiped his face with his hand, his charm drained, leaving behind only fear. For a moment I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. But then I remembered the night I packed boxes in my home, neighbors whispering as I carried my life to the car. I remembered lying awake in that guest room, my body aching, my heart breaking, wondering how my own flesh and blood could leave me in the cold. "Things are different now," I said finally. "You will work. You will earn. But don't expect me to forget." The silence between us was heavier than any thunderstorm that ever rolled across Texas. When I walked away, I didn't look back. For the first time in months, my steps felt light. The weight I had carried since that night at the kitchen table no longer belonged to me. I had handed it back to the ones who had earned it. And now they were the ones drowning in it. In the days after the town hall, word spread quickly. The employees who had whispered during my confrontation carried the story like wildfire through the company halls. By the end of the week, everyone knew. The cafeteria widow they thought of as just another face in the crowd was in fact the owner of the holding company that had secured Silverpath's expansion. And my sons? They couldn't hide from it. At first, Marco avoided me completely. He skipped meetings, called in sick, even tried to request a transfer to another division. But Silverpath didn't bend for him. He wasn't the boss's son. He was just another site supervisor who now had to prove he could do the work he bragged about. Julian, on the other hand, tried charm. He cornered me in the lobby one morning, smile trembling at the edges. "Mom, can we talk? Just the two of us." I agreed, though not for his sake. I needed to say things that had gone unsaid. We sat in a cafe across from the office tower, the hiss of the espresso machine filling the silences he didn't know how to carry. "Mom," he began, his hands folded tight. "We were wrong. I was wrong. But you have to understand, we thought we were doing something for all of us. We thought." I stopped him with a raised hand. "No. You thought about yourselves. You wanted shortcuts. You wanted to live big without doing the work. You didn't think of me at all. And when it all went wrong, you let me carry the fall alone." His eyes dropped to the table. For once, the words that usually came so easily to him weren't enough. I leaned closer, voice steady. "I am not here to punish you, Julian. I am here to remind you of what you forgot: respect. From now on, you and your brother will keep your jobs because you earn them. Not because of me. Not in spite of me. And if you can't, the company will let you go like anyone else. My hands won't tremble when that day comes." He nodded, silent. The boy who once could talk circles around me had nothing left to say. Later I spoke with Marco. He didn't sit across from me at a cafe. He came to my borrowed room, his large frame hunched like a boy caught stealing. His voice cracked as he apologized, though he never once said the word sorry. Instead, he promised to make it right. "Make it right by doing your work," I said. "Make it right by treating people better than you treated me. And make it right by providing for your children without expecting me to sacrifice again." That was the line. My grandchildren. They had no blame in this, no hand in the betrayal. For them, I decided to open a small trust, a safety net they could one day use for college or for their first homes. But for Marco and Julian, there would be no rescue, no shortcuts, no more open hands from me. In the boardroom, I pushed for reforms that made Silverpath stronger. Better pay for the workers who clean the hospitals at midnight, stricter enforcement of contracts so vendors weren't cheated, more accountability at every level. The very values my sons had trampled became the backbone of the company they now worked for. And the irony was not lost on me. They now answered to a system built from the lessons they had refused to learn at home. At night, when I returned to my little guest room, I no longer felt like a guest in life. My power was quiet, yes, but it was real. I had boundaries now, firm ones. My sons could not cross them without consequences. And for the first time in years, I knew they understood that. They had taken my home, my savings, and nearly my dignity. But here I stood, stronger, not smaller. I had not been buried. I had been planted. And now the roots were holding fast. Months passed, and with each one I felt myself growing lighter, as though the heavy cloak of betrayal had finally slipped from my shoulders. I no longer woke in the middle of the night replaying the sound of pen on paper, or the shame of packing boxes under the watchful eyes of neighbors. That pain had hardened into something else. Wisdom, the kind that doesn't shout but settles deep into your bones. With the dividends from Magnolia Rise Holdings, I bought myself a small cottage near the San Antonio Riverwalk. It wasn't as large as the house Arturo and I once shared, but it didn't need to be. It was cozy, filled with sunlight in the mornings and the sound of water not too far off. On the back porch I planted bougainvillea just like the one Arturo loved, its blossoms wild and stubborn, spilling over the fence as if to remind me that life keeps reaching forward no matter what walls you build. I kept my distance from Marco and Julian, though not from their children. My grandchildren visited often, their laughter filling the rooms the way it used to when my boys were small. I set aside money for their futures, a gift that carried no strings, only hope. But for my sons I gave no more than boundaries. They had to live with the choices they made, and in that there was justice enough. Every now and then Marco would stop by, quieter than he used to be. He'd stand awkwardly by the bougainvillea, hands stuffed in his pockets, eyes lowered. He spoke less of dreams and more of lessons, though I noticed he still struggled to say the words "I'm sorry." Julian came too, sometimes with gifts. Flowers, a bottle of wine. But gifts don't fix broken trust. I would thank him politely, then change the subject. They were no longer the center of my life. I was. In the evenings, I sat on the porch with a glass of sweet tea, watching the sun dip low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Neighbors would wave, some stopping to chat, others simply nodding with respect. Word had spread after all. People knew now that I was not a woman to be dismissed, not a mother to be stripped of her dignity without consequence. If you were to ask me what I learned, I would tell you this. Family is sacred, but dignity is not for sale. Blood may tie us together, but respect is what keeps us whole. When that respect is broken, you have every right to stand tall, even if it means standing alone. I don't carry bitterness. I carry clarity. My sons will always be my sons, but I no longer confuse love with blind trust. Trust must be earned, just like a paycheck, just like a reputation. And when it is broken, you do not have to offer it again just because you share the same last name. The cottage, the bougainvillea, the quiet evenings by the river. These are enough for me. Enough and more. So if you're listening to my story now, take this with you. Don't let betrayal define you. Let it reveal you. Let it carve out the strength you didn't know you carried. And never forget, dignity once reclaimed is the sweetest victory of all. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.